Now the brain is one of the areas that I will not spend very much time on. The brain, it's a lot of memory work, to be honest. It's fascinating, but you can learn most of this from the PowerPoint. I do have some pictures. You'll see that this picture here that I have is already on your worksheet. I put this graphic here because as much detail as we might be showing you, I just want you to know that we're skipping over so much. So this graphic you don't need to know, but the layers of the brain, starting from the skull, going all the way into the brain itself, there's a lot of things going on, a lot of words, a lot of descriptions, and if you decide to study neuro in third or fourth year, you'll go into that information. So the brain is got this big giant region on the outside, which we call the cerebrum. The cortex. If you ever see the word cortex, you saw it with the kidney, with the renal cortex and the medulla. It means the inside. You saw it with the adrenal gland, with the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. And so here we see it again with the brain, with the cerebral cortex. No medulla this time. And the brain is fascinating. It's incredibly complex. It is protected from the outside world by the skull, and if you bang your head, then the brain is still protected, but we do know that if you bang your head poorly, I don't know if there's a way to bang your head well, then you will damage your brain. We call this a concussion, and there are many different types of concussions. At this point, I break off into a whole story talking about an anecdote of this one boy who was in the water, and he was swimming at a camp, and then he got hit by a boat. All his friends saw it coming, but his back was turned, and he was like a super athletic boy that was involved and very popular in school. He got hit by this boat, and it's a fascinating story. It's called Serial Killer Whisperer, and the boy does not become a serial killer, but the story of what happens is, I don't want to say inspiring, but it's interesting. It's interesting, and I'd like to share that. So if you want to know more, just say the word, and we'll meet, and we'll talk all about that book. So the different parts of the brain that you should be familiar with, you might have heard of something called meningitis. So the meninges is a particular membrane that surrounds the brain, and it's part of the system that helps protect the brain from the rest of the body. You know that if you take certain kind of foods or certain kind of drugs, we don't want them going immediately to your brain, because imagine your brain reacted to chemicals in your food immediately. That wouldn't be good. So we have this thing called the blood-brain barrier that protects the brain from the rest of the body circulation. And this is actually the nemesis of many drug manufacturers, in that they have to design a drug that can get to the brain to help it if there's a problem, but the blood-brain barrier is very difficult to get across. So the cerebrum is that big region on the outside. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, and you'll see it in the PowerPoint. The thalamus you have not heard of, but the hypothalamus you have. Hypo is a prefix that means below. Hyper means above. So the thalamus is a region of the brain, and the thalamus is super important. Every single major sense that comes from outside the brain goes through the thalamus. The thalamus is the gatekeeper, and it determines where that information needs to go. You'll see that the thalamus is on top of the spinal cord, so it makes sense it has that job. The cerebellum is very distinctive. It's located here at the back. It's responsible for balance. How do they figure these things out? Well, typically when people are brain damaged or have some kind of major trauma to the brain in that region, and they're no longer able to walk properly or balance or lose muscle tone, then they're like, oh, okay, well that's responsible for this part of your body. Your medulla oblongata, I don't know if you guys ever seen that movie Waterboy. People still talk about his amygdala and the medulla oblongata, and it's interesting. These are primitive parts of the brain that are responsible for things like breathing and heart rate and those sorts of things. So when we go into the brain, you're responsible for knowing about the forebrain, the midbrain, the hindbrain. The hindbrain is the primitive part we talked about with the cerebellum for balance, the pons, and the medulla oblongata there. The limbic system. The limbic system, do I still have this open? I do. The limbic system is associated with your emotions. So when you have damage to your limbic system, sometimes you have anger management problems, but I'm talking about a diagnosable and not just you're upset about something. The limbic system is it's not all contiguous either, right? The brain is all very much intermeshed with one system versus the other. You can't just separate one out from another. But the limbic system It includes memory, because you need to know if something that you're looking at is going to have an emotional context. And when the limbic system is activated, then typically it will go into your memory immediately, and you will then respond in a positive or negative fashion. Many times when your limbic system is involved, you can't really control necessarily immediately how you are going to react. It takes a little bit of practice. The limbic system is something that you might study in the future. The limbic system also, because of the nature of it being an emotional context, it's innervated with the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system we're going to talk much more about when we get to stress. And we're going to talk about stress next week. Okay? The anterior pituitary we talked about already. So we know the anterior pituitary is responsible for releasing a whole slew of hormones, and some of those hormones will have an impact on your body. Anyway, limbic system deals with emotion. Right. Your thalamus, I mentioned, is a gatekeeper, and all your sensory stimuli go through your thalamus, and then your thalamus directs it to the right portion of your brain. Your hypothalamus we talked about last week, and it is the master of the master gland. It controls the pituitary through releasing hormones, tropic hormones, and it also is the osmoregulatory center, the thermoregulatory center, it controls many things. So the hypothalamus is super important. The cerebellum is for balance, and if you were to look at certain animals, you'll notice their cerebellum is, relatively speaking, larger than ours, and their balance is incredible. Think of an animal's incredible balance, and that is going to have a relatively large cerebellum. With the midbrain and hindbrain, so here's a spinal cord, and as you go up the spinal cord, you'll notice that the spinal cord is wrapped around by the pons and the medulla oblongata. At the very top of it is the thalamus. These are all certain regions of the brain responsible for things that, as I said before, you typically don't think about in terms of breathing and vasoconstriction and vasodilation and so on. The cerebrum, so this is the large part of the brain. This is something that allows, that's one of the reasons why humans are who we are. When we start talking about consciousness and trying to get an understanding of what's happening there and conscious thought, the cerebrum is responsible for this. The cerebrum is divided into several lobes. They include the frontal lobe. Again, if you want to have a Google Meet and talk about the way they fixed people who had certain problems, now if you have attention deficit disorder, or if you are particularly aggressive, sometimes they might medicate you, or they'll try to talk to you and use certain cognitive behavior, maybe therapy, to help you be able to interact with other people in society without damaging yourself or other people. But back in the day, they used to take a pick and they would stick it right through your eye orbital, and they would kind of mash up the front part of your frontal lobe in the process known as a lobotomy. So if you're interested in talking about that, then that's something we could talk about at a Google Meet. There's also the parietal lobe, which is associated with temperature, touch, pressure, and pain. It has the somatosensory cortex, which is an activity we would have done. You might want to do it now. So you can take two little pins that are relatively close to each other, and you can attach them, like maybe a paper clip, and you attach them to a ruler. And put them as close as possible to each other and put them in the middle of your palm. And you'll notice in the middle of your palm, or the tips of your fingers, you should be able to detect these 2 points very easily. But if you do the back of your wrist, or your elbow, or your forehead, or your neck, you'll find there's certain parts in your body where you can move those 2 pin pricks further apart, like 1 centimeter or 2 centimeters, and you can't tell that it's 2 things poking you. That's an activity we would have done in class. The temporal lobe is responsible for hearing and smelling. I say responsible. It's responsible for many things, but that is one of the things that it's primarily responsible for. I don't know if anyone here has ever fallen down and hit the back of their head and seen stars, but the reason why that's true is because that's where the occipital lobe is located, and that's responsible for vision. Anything to do with vision, your occipital lobe takes care of it. Your brain has 2 hemispheres, the left and the right, and these hemispheres are responsible for taking care of the opposite side of the body. It's really odd, right? If you design the human body yourself, you probably want to do this. But the left hemisphere controls the right part of your body, and the right hemisphere controls the left part of your body. What's really interesting is that these hemispheres, even though they can control everything inside your body, they do have very specific jobs. So Some people talk about a logic, and some people talk about talk about creativity, and they say if you're left-handed, that means you're right-brained and you're more creative, and if you're right-handed, that means you're left-brained and you're more logical. I just want to clear something up. It's not that simple. This left-handed, right-handedness, there is certain things associated with handedness, but this idea that if you're left-handed, you're more creative, that's, in many cases, just people talking and people living up to an expectation. It is not that simple. There is certain responsibilities of left brain and right brain, but anything the right brain, the left brain can do, and anything the left brain can do, the right brain can do. So let's be clear about that as well. One of the things I did want to talk about, and again, we don't have a lot of time, but maybe you can do some research on this, and it's called split brain therapy. So the two hemispheres, you'll notice they're connected by this one piece called the corpus callosum. I don't know if you can see it there, corpus callosum. It connects the left and right hemisphere, otherwise they're disconnected. So left hemisphere, whenever anything happens in the left hemisphere, so anything happens over here, then it will tell the right hemisphere, and information will go over to the right hemisphere to the same spot. And so now the right hemisphere knows what the left hemisphere knows, and we're good to go. And it stops. But sometimes a problem occurs where the left hemisphere will tell the right hemisphere that this is happening, like you've been touched at this particular spot, and then the right hemisphere will say, okay, thank you. And then it will send a message over to the left hemisphere saying, hey, we've been touched. And then the left hemisphere will say, okay, thank you. And then the left hemisphere will tell the right hemisphere, hey, we've been touched, and then it'll get bigger. And eventually with each of these transmissions, you get more and more of the brain stimulated. If enough of the brain gets stimulated, you'll end up with a seizure. And so these seizures can be either very small, petit mal, or grand mal, which is the classic seizure that you often see in movies. The Joker in Batman, the latest Batman, or I think it was called Joker, I can't remember what it's called. There was a seizure. They talked about these seizures. So how do you fix this problem? This is a classic example of a positive feedback loop. How do you fix this problem? Well, one way to fix this problem is to cut the corpus callosum. And if you cut this callosum, then the left and the right brain can no longer talk to each other. But when they did this, some really interesting phenomena occurred. This one lady, one of the first people to undergo this therapy, she said that she'd go into her cupboard and she knew what she was going to pick, and then when she left, she was wearing not what she expected. Her body wasn't reacting the way she expected it to. And what ended up happening was these two brains got separated and they took on their own personalities. And so imagine the implications of that. So now you have two brains, and what does that mean in terms of who you are? Anyway, I can't spend too much time on that. That's another Google Meet if you want to talk more about it. Okay, so that's your brain. The last thing that I would talk about is the senses. And so the sensory information is fascinating, and all those things that you explored when you first started this lesson around the attentional blindness and inattentional blindness and attentional blink and the McGurk effect, a lot of that deals with the senses. So what I want to do for you here is I just want to go over one example of how a sense works. If we're in class, I'd go over several, and then you can pick any one of those to have a better understanding of. So reviewing that format I showed you once before, we have a stimulus. Let's say this is vision, right? So if this is vision, then that will be light. But it could be any one of these senses, right? It could be chemical, which would be taste or smell, mechanical, which could be touch or sound, right? Light, which is vision. And so that stimulus is then picked up by a receptor. And so the receptor for vision are our photoreceptors, which are inside our retina, and these are our rods and cones. And the receptor will then send information. Well, so there's a transduction event that happens in the receptor, and it amplifies, which also happens in the retina. And we'll look at that in just a moment. And then it will send this information, it'll transmit it along, so it gets transmitted, transmission, along the optic nerve. So in grade 10, we talked about the optic nerve where it enters the eye in that blind spot. And then that will go through the thalamus, potentially through the occipital lobe eventually, in the control center. There's a lot of places it goes. And in here, we'll say the occipital lobe, which is a part of the cerebrum. You'll get both sensation, where it detects the information that's coming in, so it's bright, it's red, and then you'll perceive and you'll attach meaning to that signal that's coming in. And remember, as all this information is being processed, let me put this. Optic nerve is a sensory neuron. Inside the control center, we're going to have interneurons. And then if we were to continue this, we'd have motor neurons to react. So this, everything that's happening here, this is the sensory flow. And I'm attaching it to homeostasis, specifically the nervous system. And so now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to specifically talk about the eye and how the eye works. I wish we had more time, because in class we would talk about olfaction and how it's attached to memory. When you smell something, how you remember things. We would talk about touch and it's kind of mixed up wiring that occurs depending on where you're touched on the back of your neck versus your finger, deep touch versus light touch, and so on. So there's so many things I would like to talk about. Chemoreceptors are found in your tongue and in your nose. Taste is a factor of both your tongue and your smell. Olfaction is phenomenal in how it works. There's electro signals that the electroreceptors are able to detect electrical signals around you. Mechanoreceptors that detect motion, the lateral line of a fish. When that gets more complex, you get the mechanoreceptors that are found inside our skin. Our ear has mechanical receptors that are displaced by sound waves. Why do we get dizzy? We would have done an exercise in class where I would spun a volunteer around in the class, and we would have watched their eyes go through this really weird phenomena, and then we would have watched them try to walk a line, but they probably would have fallen down. We would have caught them though. They would have not got injured. And your ear is also responsible, in addition to sound, is responsible for balance and for understanding forward motion. If you've ever ridden an elevator or fallen asleep in a car, sometimes you will be sleeping, and if it's a very smooth road, you can't tell you're moving, and then you open your eyes, and it's it's a weird effect, because suddenly your eyes tell you're moving, but your ears tell you're not, and you might get nauseous. Some people get motion sickness for that reason. So I want to focus on the eye. So take a look at the eye. The eye is just phenomenal the way it works. And in this graphic I have on the screen, I put green triangles on each of these spirals. There's nothing in the middle, and no matter how you look, you're going to think you see a square. And this is the hardwiring of your brain. Your brain has so much information it must deal with, so in many cases it tries to cut corners by just, making assumptions. And so that's where we're getting this whole top-down, bottom-up kind of processing. If you think something's going to be there, your brain will just put it there in many cases. And I know it sounds like, well, I just need to be more observant, which is true, but there's just so much happening in the world, your brain is just that's how your brain operates. And for those who study psychology and neurobiology, you'll look more at that. If I take a look at this, if you look at this very carefully, you might be able to see the shape of something in here. Your brain is always trying to make sense of the world, and this could look like just nonsense, but eventually you'll make out a pattern. I'll show you the pattern, I'll go back. Once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. It's called the binding problem, where your brain's always trying to make sense of the world, and it binds things into a pattern that makes sense. There's other things as well. If I look at this illusion here, in this illusion, these lines, this one here looks longer, this one looks shorter, because of how our brain deals with angles. Also, if I take a look at this window we assume that these two lines are the same length, but they're not. We are recognizing this is a window, so we know that the window is a rectangle, so these two lines should be the same, but in this image that's two-dimensional, they're not the same. They're actually different lengths. Our brain is designed to see things in a certain way. And when we see them out of context, it makes it a little bit harder. So in grade 10, we talked about the makeup of the eye, the anatomy of the eye. So coming back to us here in grade 12, recognize that the photoreceptors, like if you were designing an eye, you probably wouldn't design it like this, but the photoreceptors are located at the very back of the eye. The light ray must go through everything in order to make it to the photoreceptors, through the cornea, through the pupil, through the lens, into the aqueous and vitreous humor, and way back here at the very back of the eye is a photoreceptor. And when we get there, we blow that up and look at it more clearly, we'll see that the actual photoreceptors are past all the other cells. There's other cells in the retina that don't actually receive the light. And the light must go through all that before it gets to the photoreceptors, the rods and the cones at the very back of the eye. So I would like to explain how these work. What I want to explain is I want to explain the actual transduction event. And the reason why I'm pausing, because I'm deciding on the fly of whether or not I should or whether or not I should not. Because it's a lot of information, and realistically, I'm not going to test you on it. It's super fascinating, but do you really have the time with everything else that's going on to absorb all this information? I don't know. So I'll explain a couple of things, but I'm not going to go in the same detail that I would normally. Okay. So what I have in this graphic here is I have the two photoreceptors. One is a rod and one is a cone. Can you tell which one's which? I mean, apart from the fact they're labeled. And both of these are very interesting cells. In these cells, they have very special protein, constructs that are photosensitive. This chemical known as rhodopsin is photoactive. When light energy hits the rhodopsin, it causes a change in its shape. And that change in the shape, as a transmembrane protein, will cause it to open up pores in the membrane, which will then allow the influx of something. And as that something comes in, it causes a change that will create an action potential, or not. This rhodopsin is made up of retinal and opsin. Retinol, which we associate with a particular vitamin, if you eat enough of this vitamin, then your eyes are great. If you don't eat enough of this vitamin, your eyes are not. Do you know what vitamin that is? You might be able to tell from the name. If you don't, maybe you should look it up. So what happens? Or is it? Sorry. The eye. Now, in the eye, I'm just going to draw it here. You have this diagram, but I'm going to draw it as well. There is a receptor. I'm going to start with the cone, because the cone, I start with the rod, because the rods are much easier to understand. Rods detect light, right? They're light sensitive, so they're not colors. They're just kind of, there's light, there's no light. It's kind of gray, black, white. And when it's dark, this is active, and the rod here in the dark, it will cause sodium channels to open up. So sodium comes in, which causes a depolarization. And because this is depolarized, it releases a neurotransmitter. And the neurotransmitter that it releases causes an IPSP. And this IPSP will then inhibit the next cell in the line. And this next cell is known as a bipolar cell. So in the dark, the rod is activated. It releases an iPSP neurotransmitter that inhibits the bipolar cell. The bipolar cell will then not do anything. And this next cell down here, known as a ganglion cell, which leads to the optic nerve, will not send any signal. So you see nothing. In the dark, you see nothing. So now let's turn the lights on. When you turn the lights on, the potassium channels will open up. So potassium channels will open up, potassium will come out, and then that will cause this cell to become hyperpolarized, meaning that it won't release any neurotransmitter. And because it's not releasing any neurotransmitter, the bipolar cell is now active. And the bipolar cell will release a neurotransmitter that causes an EPSP, which will stimulate the ganglia cell, and a signal will go along the optic nerve to the brain. So in the light, the rod is turned off, but it sends a signal ultimately to the brain, and you see light. So the stimulus is light. The transduction event is the retinol, the rhodopsin, changing shape, causing the membrane to allow the influx of sodium or not, potassium. And then we get transmission to the optic nerve. Inside the eye, there's these other cells as well, the horizontal cells and the amacrine cells. And these horizontal cells and amacrine cells, they help with the amplification of a light signal, of a light photon. At the end of this process, we are able to see or not see. This is the process of sensory stimulus or sensory stimulation. So I've now gone through it. I've gone through it relatively quickly. Normally we spend much more time. You have your worksheet. On your worksheet, you're going to look a little bit at color vision and look a little bit at color blindness. I didn't talk about consciousness, which I would have loved to. Talked about locked in, and so in the PowerPoint, I'm going to give you a few places where you might want to find out more information. And if you're interested, we'll talk. If not, complete the sheet. Most of this is going to be cursory because you're going to be focusing on your homeostasis druggy presentation. So where does the druggy presentation come in? So now that you're doing the druggy presentation, what many of you will recognize is that your drugs that you're doing are imitating neurotransmitters. And because they're imitating certain neurotransmitters, they're causing things to occur. Dopamine is a classic one. Dopamine makes you feel good. When you take cocaine or opium, heroin, and ecstasy, and they're typically affecting dopamine levels. If you have things that affect mood, it might be affecting serotonin levels, and so on and so on and so on. So we'll learn all about that on Friday when you guys do your debate. All right? I will call this a